I should have kept walking, should have minded my own business like every other exhausted soul shuffling through that dimly lit parking garage at 2 a.m. But when I saw him slumped against that midnight black Mercedes, with blood pooling beneath him like spilled wine catching the sickly yellow fluorescent light, something deep in my chest, something I thought I'd buried alongside my brother 3 years ago, refused to let me look away. The garage was nearly empty, just row after row of concrete pillars casting long shadows that seemed to swallow the sparse overhead lights, and the echo of my footsteps in my sensible nursing clogs had been the only sound until I heard it. A low, ragged breathing that spoke of pain and something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand at attention, even as my feet carried me forward against every instinct of self-preservation I'd ever cultivated. My shift at Metropolitan General had been a nightmare of the usual variety. 16 hours of code blues and overdoses, and a car accident that brought in a family of 4, where only the father survived. And all I'd wanted was to collapse into my bed and sleep for the next 12 hours, without dreaming of the things I'd seen, the lives I'd held in my hands, the ones that slipped away no matter how hard I fought. The hospital had drained me down to my bones, left me hollow and aching in that particular way that only those who work in emergency medicine truly understand, where you've given so much of yourself to strangers that there's barely anything left for the woman staring back at you in the bathroom mirror. But apparently I had just enough left to be catastrophically stupid. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, all sharp angles and dark intensity, even while bleeding out on cold concrete. And I knew, God, I knew the moment I saw his face, that approaching him was a mistake that would reshape the entire trajectory of my carefully constructed, painfully boring, meticulously safe little life. His hair was dark as a raven's wing and slightly too long, falling across a face that could have been carved from marble by some Renaissance master with a penchant for depicting fallen angels, all high cheekbones and a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble that somehow made him look even more devastating. But it was his eyes that stopped my heart mid-beat, when they opened and locked onto mine with an intensity that felt like being struck by lightning. Deep, endless brown that was almost black in the dim light. Eyes that had seen things that would make my worst shifts look like a day at the beach. Eyes that assessed me in a single sweep and found me somehow both wanting and worthwhile in the same breath. "You need to leave," he said, and his voice was rough as gravel, accented in a way that spoke of Eastern European origins and expensive boarding schools that hadn't quite polished away the edges. And there was a command in those 4 words that probably made grown men scramble to obey without question. I should have listened, should have turned around and walked straight back to my car and driven home and forgotten I'd ever seen him. But I'd spent the last 3 years of my life saving people who probably didn't deserve saving, stitching up gang members and addicts and drunk drivers, and I'd lost the ability to walk away from someone bleeding out, regardless of how dangerous my instincts were screaming he might be. "You've been shot," I said, and I hated how my voice shook even as I dropped to my knees beside him, my nurse's brain immediately cataloging the damage with clinical precision, even as another part of me, the part that was still a woman and not just a medical professional, registered the sheer size of him, the way his expensive suit jacket couldn't hide the breadth of his shoulders or the lean, powerful muscle beneath. There were 2 wounds that I could see, one in his left shoulder where blood had soaked through his white dress shirt and suit jacket, turning the fabric a deep crimson that looked black in the jaundiced light, and another that had grazed his ribs on the right side, leaving a furrow that bled freely, but wasn't immediately life-threatening if we could get it stopped. "I'm aware," he said, and there was almost amusement in his tone, despite the pain that tightened the corners of his eyes and made his breathing shallow. And he was watching me with an intensity that made me feel simultaneously like prey and like the most fascinating thing he'd encountered in years. His hand moved, and I saw the gun tucked into his waistband at the same moment he placed his palm over it. A clear warning that I registered and ignored, because I was already pressing my hands against his shoulder wound, applying pressure with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from too many years in emergency rooms and trauma bays. The blood was warm and wet beneath my fingers, soaking through my scrubs and making my hands slippery, and I could feel his heartbeat beneath my palm, strong and steady despite the blood loss. The pulse of a man who refused to die on a parking garage floor like some common criminal, even though the evidence suggested that's exactly what he might be. He hissed when I pressed harder, his hand coming up to grip my wrist with bruising strength that should have frightened me but instead sent a shock of something disturbingly close to electricity racing up my arm and settling low in my belly where it had absolutely no business being. "What's your name?" I asked, because I needed him talking, needed him conscious and aware, and because some part of me desperately wanted to put a name to this beautiful, dangerous stranger whose blood was staining my hands and whose eyes were looking at me like he couldn't quite figure out if I was an angel or an idiot. "Dante," he said after a pause that stretched just long enough to make me think he might not answer at all. And the name suited him perfectly. Dark and elegant and vaguely ominous in a way that made me think of ancient poetry about descending into hell. "You should go, Isla," he added, and I froze because I absolutely had not told him my name, had never seen him before in my life, and the fact that he knew it sent ice water through my veins even as my hands remained steady on his wounds. "How do you—" I started to ask, but the screech of tires on concrete cut me off, the sound echoing through the parking garage like a scream, and Dante's entire body went rigid beneath my touch, every muscle tensing with the coiled readiness of a predator about to strike. Black SUVs with tinted windows came around the corner far too fast, their headlights cutting through the shadows like searchlights, and I felt Dante's hand on the back of my neck pulling me down and forward even as he was moving, dragging us both behind the Mercedes, with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a man with 2 bullet holes in him. His other hand clamped over my mouth, and I could taste the copper tang of his blood on my lips, where his palm pressed against them, could feel the solid wall of his chest against my back, as he held me pinned between his body and the car, close enough that I could feel every breath he took, and smell the expensive cologne that clung to him beneath the scent of gunpowder and blood. We were hidden in the shadows between the Mercedes and a concrete pillar, and I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my ears so loudly that I was certain whoever was in those SUVs would hear it too, would find us and finish whatever they'd started. The SUVs stopped, and I heard car doors opening, the sound of expensive shoes on concrete, and voices speaking in rapid Russian that I couldn't understand but whose tone was unmistakable. They were hunting, searching, looking for Dante with the kind of methodical precision that spoke of professional killers rather than street thugs. Through the gap between the Mercedes and the pillar, I could see 3 men, all dressed in dark suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent, all carrying weapons with the casual ease of people who use them regularly. And the rational part of my brain that was still functioning was screaming that I was going to die here, that helping this stranger was going to be the last mistake I ever made. Dante's hand was still over my mouth, and I could feel the tension in his body, could sense him calculating distances and angles and probabilities in the way that predators do when deciding whether to run or fight. And I knew with absolute certainty that if these men found us, the parking garage was going to turn into a bloodbath. One of the men walked past our hiding spot, so close that I could have reached out and touched his perfectly polished shoes, and I held my breath until my lungs burned and black spots danced at the edges of my vision, certain that my racing heart was going to give us away. "He's not here," one of them said in accented English, and I felt Dante's grip on me tighten fractionally, a warning to stay absolutely still and silent. "Check the stairwells and the other levels, and find out who owns that Honda Civic. Someone was here, and I want to know who." They were talking about my car, my safe and boring and completely unremarkable car that I'd parked 3 spaces down from where we were currently hiding, and the realization that I was now part of whatever this was hit me like a physical blow. These men were going to find my car, were going to run my plates, were going to know my name and where I lived and everything about me, and whatever thin veneer of safety my ordinary life had provided was about to be shattered into a million irretrievable pieces. The men spent another 5 minutes searching, their footsteps echoing through the garage like a countdown to discovery. And I spent every second of it pressed against Dante's chest, trying not to shake apart from fear and adrenaline and the slowly dawning understanding that my life as I knew it was over. Finally, mercifully, they got back in their SUVs and drove away, the sound of their engines fading into the distance until there was nothing left but the hum of fluorescent lights and the ragged sound of both our breathing. Dante's hand dropped from my mouth, but he didn't move away, didn't put any distance between us, and when I turned my head to look at him, his face was inches from mine, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, and the way pain had drawn fine lines around them. "You need to get out of here," he said, and his voice was weaker now, the blood loss finally catching up with him, and I could see the way he was struggling to stay conscious, to maintain that iron control that seemed as much a part of him as his bones. "You'll die," I said, and it wasn't a question but a statement of fact, because I knew exactly how much blood he'd lost and how much more he was losing with every passing second. And if he didn't get help soon, none of his obvious danger or power or lethal grace was going to matter. "Better me than you," he said, and there was something in his eyes that looked almost like regret, like he was genuinely sorry that I'd stumbled into his nightmare, and that tiny flash of humanity beneath all that darkness made my decision for me. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, and looked around the garage with the same kind of focused assessment I used in the ER when everything was going to hell and I needed to make a dozen critical decisions in the space of a heartbeat. My car was close, the garage was empty, and those men were gone for now. And I had maybe a 10-minute window to do something so monumentally stupid that future me was definitely going to curse present me for it. "Can you walk?" I asked, and Dante looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts surprise and something that might have been respect. And he nodded even though we both knew it was probably a lie. Getting him into my car was a nightmare of grunts and barely suppressed screams and blood that seemed to get everywhere, coating the passenger seat and my hands and my scrubs until I looked like I'd just walked out of a horror movie. But somehow we managed it. And then I was behind the wheel driving out of that garage with a bleeding stranger who knew my name and whose enemies were definitely going to come looking for him. I should have been terrified, should have been taking him to the hospital or calling the police or doing literally anything other than what I was actually doing. But my hands were steady on the wheel and my mind was already racing ahead to my apartment, to the supplies I had there, to the ways I could keep him alive long enough to figure out what fresh hell I'd just willingly walked into. "Why are you doing this?" Dante asked from the passenger seat, and his eyes were starting to glaze with blood loss and shock. But they were still fixed on me with that unnerving intensity that made me feel like he could see straight through to my soul. I didn't have a good answer, didn't have any answer that made sense even to myself, so I just tightened my grip on the steering wheel and drove toward my apartment with a dying stranger bleeding all over my car, and the certainty that whatever happened next was going to change everything, and all I could think as I pulled into my building's underground parking was that somewhere, somehow, my little brother was probably laughing at me from whatever came after, because he'd always said my need to save everyone was going to get me killed one day, and it looked like he might have been right. I'd brought home strays before, mangy cats with missing eyes, wounded birds that I'd nursed back to health in shoeboxes lined with soft cloth, even a 3-legged dog that had followed me home from the hospital one particularly bleak winter night. But never a 6'3" wall of muscle and murder who looked at me like I was either his salvation or his next victim. And certainly never someone whose blood was currently soaking into my bathroom floor while I ransacked my medical supplies with shaking hands that I absolutely could not afford to have shaking right now. Getting Dante up 3 flights of stairs to my apartment had been an exercise in controlled chaos, his arms slung over my shoulders, and his weight nearly dragging us both down more than once. And I'd been certain that Mrs. Chen from 2B was going to open her door and see us, was going to call the police and end this insanity before it could really begin. But luck, or fate, or whatever cruel deity was orchestrating this nightmare, had kept the hallways empty. My bathroom was small and outdated, with cracked tile that I kept meaning to replace and a mirror that had seen better days. But it had good light and a lock on the door. And right now, that was all that mattered as I cut away Dante's ruined suit jacket and the dress shirt beneath it, revealing a torso that looked like a roadmap of violence and survival. The bullet wound in his shoulder was bad, but not catastrophic. The round had gone clean through without hitting the subclavian artery, which was a minor miracle, but it needed to be cleaned and packed and sutured. And I had maybe half the supplies I would have had in a proper ER and approximately zero of the backup if something went wrong. His other wound, the graze along his ribs, was messier than I'd initially thought. Deep enough that it needed attention, but not deep enough to have penetrated the thoracic cavity. And I focused on that small mercy as I prepped my makeshift surgical field on the closed toilet seat. Dante was semi-conscious, his head lolling back against the tiled wall, and his breathing shallow and rapid. Shock setting in, despite my best efforts to keep him warm and stable. And every few minutes he would mumble something in Russian or Italian, languages that flowed from his lips like dark music, even while he was half delirious with pain and blood loss. I worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent too many years in trauma bays, cleaning and debriding the wounds with steady hands, even as my mind raced with all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. All the reasons I should have taken him to a hospital, despite the obvious fact that hospitals meant questions and police reports and explanations I definitely didn't have. "Stay with me, Dante," I murmured as I irrigated the shoulder wound, watching pink-tinged saline run down his chest and pool on the floor, and his hand shot out with startling speed to grip my wrist hard enough to bruise, his eyes flying open and fixing on me with a clarity that hadn't been there moments before. For a second, I thought he didn't recognize me, thought he was going to hurt me in his confused state. But then something shifted in his gaze and his grip loosened fractionally, though he didn't let go, and I could see him fighting to stay present, to maintain control even while his body was trying to shut down. "You're insane," he said, and his voice was rough and raw, scraped over gravel and exhaustion. But there was something almost like admiration underneath the words, and I found myself laughing, actually laughing, at the absurdity of being called insane by a man who'd been shot twice and was currently bleeding in my bathroom. "You're not the first person to tell me that," I replied, and I gently extracted my wrist from his grip so I could continue working, packing the through-and-through shoulder wound with gauze soaked in antibiotic solution before I started the process of suturing the entrance and exit wounds closed. My hands moved with muscle memory born of thousands of similar procedures, and I let myself fall into the familiar rhythm of it. Let the technical aspects of wound care override the screaming panic in the back of my mind that kept insisting I was harboring a criminal and was probably going to end up dead or in prison or both. He passed out somewhere around the fourth suture, his body finally giving in to the trauma and blood loss. And I was grateful for it because the rib wound needed debridement that was going to hurt like hell, and I didn't have anything stronger than over-the-counter painkillers to give him. I worked in silence, broken only by my own breathing and the occasional drip of water from the ancient faucet, cleaning and closing and bandaging until both wounds were as stable as I could make them without a hospital's resources. And then I just sat there on the cold bathroom floor next to this unconscious stranger and tried to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. It was almost 4 a.m. by the time I'd gotten Dante cleaned up and moved to my bed, the only bed in my tiny one-bedroom apartment, because laying him on my ancient couch seemed both impractical and somehow insulting, given that he'd been shot, and was clearly someone important enough that other important people wanted him dead. I'd stripped him down to his boxer briefs, partly because his clothes were ruined and soaked with blood, and partly because I needed to check for other injuries I might have missed. And that's when I really saw the full extent of what his body had endured over what must have been years or possibly decades of violence. There were scars everywhere, a constellation of old wounds that told stories I probably didn't want to know, knife wounds that traced along his ribs and abdomen, bullet scars that matched the fresh ones I'd just treated, burn marks on his left side that looked like they'd been inflicted deliberately rather than accidentally, and a long, wicked scar that ran from his right hip bone down his thigh that must have come close to severing the femoral artery. His body was a testament to survival, each mark a moment where death had reached for him, and he'd somehow slipped away. And I found myself wondering what kind of life left a man looking like he'd gone to war and back multiple times before what I guessed was his mid-30s. I covered him with my grandmother's quilt, the one piece of family history I had left after my brother died, and my mother drank herself into an early grave. And I sat in the chair I'd dragged in from my kitchen and just watched him breathe for a while, making sure his chest continued to rise and fall with steady rhythm, checking that the bandages weren't seeping through, being a nurse even though every other part of me was screaming that I should be running as far and as fast as I could. He looked different in sleep, less dangerous somehow, though no less devastating. His features relaxed from the perpetual alertness I'd seen even through his pain, and I caught myself noticing things I had no business noticing. The fullness of his lips, the long, dark lashes that any woman would kill for, the way his hair fell across his forehead in a way that made him look almost boyish. When dawn started creeping through my curtains, painting everything in shades of gray and gold, I finally let myself doze off in the chair, exhaustion overriding my anxiety, and I slept fitfully until I felt cold metal pressed against my temple, and my eyes flew open to find Dante sitting up in my bed with a gun pointed directly at my head. His eyes were clearer than they'd been in the parking garage, fever-bright and assessing, and for one horrible moment I was certain I'd saved a man's life only to have him kill me in my own bedroom as payment for my kindness. "Who are you?" he asked, and his voice was steady despite the fact that he should probably still be unconscious, and I realized he didn't remember me from the parking garage, didn't remember anything past the initial moments when I'd found him bleeding out against his car. "I'm the idiot who brought you here instead of letting you die," I said, and I was surprised to find that I sounded angry rather than terrified, though my heart was doing its best impression of a drum solo against my ribs, and I watched as recognition slowly filtered back into his eyes, along with something that might have been embarrassment, or respect, or possibly both. The gun lowered slowly, and Dante slumped back against my headboard, his free hand going to his shoulder, where I'd wrapped him in enough bandages to outfit a small hospital, and he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and suspicion, and a wariness that suggested he wasn't used to people helping him without expecting something in return. "You patched me up," he said. And it wasn't quite a question, but not quite a statement either, and I nodded because it seemed safer than trying to explain my complete and utter lack of rational thought last night. "You were bleeding out in a parking garage, and I'm a nurse, and apparently I have a pathological need to save people who probably don't deserve saving," I said, and I stood up from my chair even though my legs felt like water, moving toward the kitchen because I needed coffee and distance and maybe a complete personality transplant that would turn me into someone who made sensible life choices. I could hear him moving behind me, could hear the rustle of sheets and his sharply indrawn breath when he tried to stand. And then he was in my kitchen doorway wearing nothing but his boxer briefs and my grandmother's quilt wrapped around his shoulders like the world's most dangerous blanket ghost. "Why?" he asked, and the single word carried so much weight, so many layers of genuine confusion, and what sounded almost like wonder, and I realized that this was probably a man who'd been betrayed and hurt, and used so many times that simple kindness was foreign enough to be suspicious. "I don't know," I admitted, because it was the truth and because I was too tired to come up with a better answer, and I busied myself making coffee with shaking hands while trying very hard not to think about the fact that there was a half-naked man with a gun standing in my kitchen, and that my life had veered so far off the rails that I couldn't even see the tracks anymore. "My brother died 3 years ago because I couldn't save him, because I was stuck in traffic when he called, and by the time I got there he'd bled out on a sidewalk while people walked past him like he was garbage. And maybe some part of me can't stand the thought of walking past someone else who's bleeding out, even if that someone is clearly involved in something that's going to get me killed." The silence that followed my confession was heavy and charged. And when I finally turned around to look at Dante, he was watching me with an intensity that made me feel naked and exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical clothing. He moved closer, and I should have stepped back, but I found myself frozen as he invaded my space with the kind of deliberate intention that suggested he was used to taking what he wanted. And then his hand, the one not holding a gun, came up to cut my face with a gentleness that seemed completely at odds with everything else about him. "I'm sorry about your brother," he said, and I could tell he meant it. Could hear the weight of his own losses in those 5 words, and for a moment we just stood there in my tiny kitchen with the morning light streaming through the window and the smell of brewing coffee filling the air. 2 broken people who'd found each other in the worst possible way, at the worst possible time. The moment shattered when his phone, which I'd placed on my counter along with his gun and his wallet and the other items I'd removed from his pockets, began to vibrate with an incoming call, and Dante's entire demeanor shifted from almost human back to dangerous in the space of a heartbeat. He answered it in rapid Russian, his tone clipped and authoritative, and I listened to one half of a conversation I couldn't understand while I poured coffee into 2 mugs with hands that had finally stopped shaking. And when he ended the call, the look on his face made my stomach drop. "My men know you helped me," he said, and there was regret in his voice, but also a kind of resignation, like he'd known this was inevitable and had just been waiting for the other shoe to drop. "They ran your plates from the parking garage, and they're on their way here now to secure the location and make sure you're not a threat. And I need you to understand something very clearly. Isla, the people who shot me will also know about you soon if they don't already. Which means your normal life, your safe life, everything you had before you decided to play hero in that parking garage is gone, and the only question now is whether you trust me to keep you alive through what comes next." I wanted to scream at him, wanted to throw him out of my apartment and pretend none of this had happened, wanted to rewind time to the moment I'd seen him bleeding and make the smart choice to keep walking. But even as those thoughts raced through my mind, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my door, and then a firm, professional knock that was somehow more terrifying than if they'd just kicked the door down. Dante moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for someone who'd been shot twice less than 12 hours ago, positioning himself between me and the door with his gun held ready, and I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins that whatever came through that door was going to determine whether I lived or died, whether I became part of Dante's world or another casualty of it. "Those are my people," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the door. And then he glanced back at me with an expression that was almost apologetic. "After I let them in, after they sweep your apartment and confirm you're not a threat, I need you to pack a bag with whatever you can't live without, because you can't stay here anymore. And whether you like it or not, you're under my protection now, which means you're coming home with me until I can neutralize the threat against both of us." The knock came again, more insistent this time, and I stood there in my kitchen holding a mug of coffee and wearing blood-stained scrubs, watching a man I'd known for less than 6 hours position himself to either save my life or end it depending on what he found on the other side of that door. And all I could think was that my brother had been right all along. My need to save broken things was definitely going to be the death of me. Though at least this particular broken thing was beautiful and dangerous, and looking at me like I was something precious worth protecting, which was more than I'd had in my life for longer than I cared to admit. He said I saved his life, spoke the words with a kind of dark reverence while his men moved through my apartment like lethal shadows checking corners and clearing rooms as if my tiny one-bedroom could possibly hide an army. But what he didn't say, what hung unspoken in the air between us heavy as smoke, was that now he owned mine. That the moment I'd pressed my hands against his wounds and made the choice to bring him here instead of leaving him to bleed out or calling the authorities, I'd signed myself over to him in ways I was only beginning to understand. The 3 men who'd arrived at my door were nothing like I'd expected. Not the stereotypical thugs from movies with their gold chains and tracksuits, but rather impeccably dressed professionals who moved with military precision and spoke in low, respectful tones, when they addressed Dante, calling him boss and sir in accented English that ranged from barely noticeable to thick as honey depending on which one was speaking. The tallest one, a man who introduced himself as Alexei, with eyes like chips of blue ice and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, had given me a look that suggested he was cataloging every way I could potentially be a threat, before apparently deciding I was harmless, which should have been reassuring, but somehow felt vaguely insulting, given everything I'd done to keep Dante alive through the night. They'd swept my apartment in under 5 minutes, their efficiency speaking to years of practice, and then they'd stood in my living room giving Dante a report in Russian that I couldn't understand but whose tone suggested things were bad and getting worse, and I'd watched the way he listened with his arms crossed over his bare chest, the grandmother's quilt abandoned on my couch, seemingly unconcerned with his state of undress, or the fact that he should probably still be in bed recovering, rather than standing here receiving intelligence briefings. When they finally switched to English, clearly for my benefit, though Dante hadn't explicitly asked them to, I learned more about the man I'd saved than I'd ever wanted to know. Learned that Dante Volkov wasn't just involved in organized crime, but was actually the head of the Volkov Bratva, the most feared Russian mafia family on the entire East Coast, controlling everything from the docks, to the underground casinos, to protection rackets that stretched from Boston to Miami. The men who'd shot him were apparently sent by a rival faction, the Constantin family, who'd been trying to spark a full-scale war between the established families in order to seize territory during the chaos, and the attack on Dante had been meant to decapitate the Volkov organization and leave it vulnerable to a hostile takeover. "The Constantines know about her," Alexei said, and his eyes flicked to me with something that might have been pity or might have been calculation, and I felt my blood turn to ice in my veins because I understood exactly what that meant even before Dante's expression went dark and dangerous in a way that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. "They had someone watching the parking garage, and they followed her car here, and while we've secured the building for now, it's only a matter of time before they make a move, and we need to relocate both of you to a more defensible position before that happens." I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that this was my home and my life, and I wasn't going anywhere with a man I'd just met regardless of how many people wanted him dead. But the words died in my throat when Dante turned to look at me with eyes that held genuine regret, mixed with an iron determination that suggested arguing would be not only pointless, but potentially dangerous. "Pack a bag," he said, and it wasn't a request despite the relatively gentle tone, and I found myself moving toward my bedroom on autopilot, my brain still trying to process the fact that I'd somehow become a target for the Russian Mafia by virtue of being a decent human being for 5 minutes. My hands were shaking again as I threw clothes into a duffel bag without really seeing what I was grabbing, adding my laptop and phone charger and the few photographs I had of my brother and my mother, back when she'd still been sober enough to smile. And I could hear Dante in the other room talking to his men in rapid Russian that sounded like orders being given and received. When I emerged from my bedroom, bag in hand and feeling like I was moving through a dream, or possibly a nightmare, I found that someone had brought clothes for Dante. Dark jeans and a black t-shirt that stretched across his shoulders in a way that should not have been attractive given the circumstances, but somehow absolutely was, and he was sliding a shoulder holster on over the shirt, wincing slightly when the leather straps pressed against his bandaged wounds. "Where are we going?" I asked, and my voice sounded small and foreign to my own ears, nothing like the confident professional tone I used at the hospital when I was running a code or talking down a patient having a psychotic break. And Dante looked at me with an expression that was impossible to read, something between protective and possessive that made my skin feel too tight. "My penthouse," he said, as if this was perfectly reasonable, as if kidnapping a woman to his home was just standard operating procedure when the Russian Mafia decided to take an interest in your life. "It's secure, defensible, and has enough armed guards that even the Constantines won't be stupid enough to try a direct assault, and you'll stay there under my protection until I can eliminate the threat against you, which I will do because this is my fault, and I don't leave debts unpaid, especially not debts that put innocent people in danger." The word innocent hung in the air between us, and I almost laughed because I didn't feel very innocent anymore. Not with my hands still stained with his blood, despite multiple washings and my apartment currently full of armed men, discussing the best way to smuggle me out without getting shot. Alexei and his team moved with practiced efficiency, one of them taking my bag while another did a final sweep of the windows and hallways, and then Dante was at my side with his hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the door with a touch that was simultaneously gentle and unyielding. The journey to his penthouse was a blur of black SUVs with tinted windows and professional drivers who took corners too fast, while Alexei sat in the front passenger seat with a very large gun resting casually across his lap. And I sat in the back next to Dante, trying not to think about the fact that I'd called in sick to the hospital using a lie about food poisoning while my entire life was being dismantled and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. Dante hadn't touched me since we'd gotten in the car, but I could feel the heat of him in the space between us. Could sense his attention on me even though his eyes were scanning the streets outside with the vigilance of someone who expected an attack at any moment. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said quietly, and the certainty in his voice should have been reassuring, but instead made me realize just how much danger I must actually be in if he felt the need to make such promises. And I turned to look at him properly for the first time since we'd left my apartment, really seeing him in the morning light that filtered through the tinted windows. He was devastating, even with exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes and pain he was clearly trying to hide, making his movements careful and measured. And there was something about the way he held himself, the perfect posture despite his injuries, the constant awareness of his surroundings, the casual command he had over everyone around him, that spoke to a life spent in control and in danger in equal measure. "Why?" I asked, and I realized I was echoing his question from my kitchen, turning it back on him because I genuinely didn't understand why he would care about protecting some random nurse who'd been foolish enough to help him beyond simple transactional gratitude. "Because you saved my life when you had no reason to, when doing so put you in danger, and because I've spent my entire existence surrounded by people who only help when there's something in it for them, and you helped expecting nothing, which makes you either the bravest or the most foolish woman I've ever met. And either way, I'm not going to let you die for that," he said. And there was something raw in his voice that made me think he was telling the truth, or at least his version of it. And I didn't know whether to be touched or terrified by the intensity of his conviction. His penthouse was nothing like I'd expected, which was foolish because I'd never actually thought about what a mafia boss's home might look like. But if I had been forced to guess, I wouldn't have imagined the sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, minimalist furniture that probably cost more than I made in a year, and original artwork on the walls that I recognized from my college art history classes as pieces that should have been in museums rather than private residences. The space was beautiful in a cold, impersonal way that suggested it was more showpiece than home, and I found myself wondering if Dante actually lived here, or if this was just another piece of armor, another layer of protection between him and the world. "Isla, this is my sister Katya," Dante said, and I turned to find a woman who could have been carved from the same marble as her brother, all sharp cheekbones and cold beauty, watching me with eyes that assessed and judged and found me wanting in the space of a single glance. She was wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than my car, and had her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that somehow made her look both professional and vaguely threatening. And when she spoke, her accent was less pronounced than Dante's, but her tone was pure ice. "The nurse," she said, and it wasn't quite an insult, but it definitely wasn't a compliment. And I felt myself straightening my spine and lifting my chin because I'd dealt with plenty of people who thought they were better than me over the years, and I'd be damned if I was going to be intimidated, in addition to being kidnapped. "Dante tells me you patched him up in your apartment rather than taking him to a hospital, which was either incredibly stupid or incredibly brave, and I haven't decided which yet. But either way, you're here now, and you're a potential liability that we need to manage until this situation with the Constantines is resolved." "Katya," Dante said, and there was a warning in his voice that made his sister's eyes narrow fractionally. And I watched the silent communication that passed between them, the kind of wordless understanding that came from years of shared history and mutual trust. And I felt suddenly, desperately alone in a way I hadn't since my brother died. The penthouse tour was brief and conducted by a woman named Irina, who appeared to be some kind of housekeeper or assistant, and I was shown to a guest suite that was larger than my entire apartment, with a bathroom that had heated floors, and a shower that could probably fit 6 people, and a bedroom with a massive bed covered in what felt like Egyptian cotton sheets that probably cost more per thread than I made per hour. "Mr. Volkov's room is through there," Irina said, pointing to a door I hadn't noticed. And when I looked at her with what must have been obvious alarm, she smiled slightly and added, "It locks from both sides, and he won't disturb you unless there's an emergency." I spent the rest of that first day in a haze of surreal displacement, wandering the penthouse like a ghost, while Dante conducted business from his home office, his voice carrying through the walls in a mixture of English and Russian and what I thought might be Italian, always authoritative and often cold, in a way that reminded me he wasn't just some wounded man I'd helped, but rather someone who commanded an empire built on violence and fear. Alexei came and went with reports and updates, and I caught fragments of conversations about containment and retaliation, and sending a message that made my stomach churn, because I understood intellectually that these were dangerous men, but hadn't fully processed what that meant in practical terms. Dinner was served in the formal dining room by a chef whose food was probably incredible, though I could barely taste it. And I sat across from Dante at a table that could have seated 20, while he watched me with an intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness. And finally, I couldn't take the silence anymore, and asked the question that had been burning in my mind since we'd arrived. "How long am I supposed to stay here?" I asked, and I heard the tremor in my voice despite my best efforts to sound calm and collected, and Dante set down his fork with careful precision before answering. "Until it's safe," he said, and when I started to protest that I had a job and a life and responsibilities, he cut me off with a look that was simultaneously gentle and implacable. "The hospital has already been contacted and told you're taking an extended leave due to a family emergency, and your rent will be paid, and anything else you need will be provided, because the alternative is that you go back to your normal life and get killed within 48 hours when the Constantines send someone to use you as leverage against me, or simply eliminate you as a loose end, and I won't allow that to happen." The certainty in his voice made it clear that argument was pointless, and I found myself standing abruptly from the table, needing space and air and distance from this man who'd taken over my entire existence in less than 24 hours. And I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering city below, and pressed my forehead against the cool glass, while trying to remember how to breathe. I heard him approach, heard the careful footsteps that suggested his wounds were bothering him more than he wanted to admit, and then he was beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body but not quite touching, giving me space while also making his presence impossible to ignore. "I know this isn't what you wanted," he said quietly, and his reflection in the window showed an expression I couldn't quite read, something almost vulnerable beneath all that dangerous control. "I know you had a life and plans and a future that didn't include being dragged into my world, but you made a choice last night when you helped me. And choices have consequences. And now I'm making a choice too. To keep you alive no matter what it costs, because I've taken enough from innocent people over the years, and I won't add your death to that ledger. And if that means keeping you here against your will until I can make you safe, then that's exactly what I'm going to do." I turned to face him then, and in the dim light of the dining room, with the city sprawled out behind us like scattered diamonds, I saw past the Mafia boss and the dangerous stranger to the man underneath. The one who'd been shot and betrayed and was carrying wounds that went far deeper than the bullets I'd removed from his flesh. And I realized with dawning horror that I didn't hate him for this, didn't even really blame him despite having every right to, because some broken part of me recognized the broken parts of him, and understood that we were both just trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy us. "Tell me about the Constantines," I said instead of all the things I probably should have said, and I watched surprise flicker across his features before it was replaced by something darker, something that looked like respect mixed with resignation. And he reached out, slowly, giving me time to pull away, and took my hand in his fingers warm and calloused against my palm. "Victor Constantine is a rabid dog who thinks he can take what my family has built over generations, and he's willing to burn everything to the ground to do it, including innocent people like you who just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I'm going to put him down like the animal he is. But first I need to make sure you're protected, because he knows that hurting you would hurt me, and he'll use that knowledge if I give him the chance," Dante said, and his grip on my hand tightened fractionally. Not enough to hurt, but enough that I could feel the leashed violence in him. The predator barely contained beneath the expensive clothes and careful manners. The next morning, I woke in the unfamiliar luxury of the guest suite to the sound of raised voices coming from somewhere in the penthouse, and I pulled on the robe that had been left for me and ventured out to find Dante in his office with Alexei and another man I didn't recognize, all of them standing around a table covered in photographs and documents that I couldn't see clearly from the doorway. "The hit on the warehouse needs to happen tonight," the unfamiliar man was saying, his accent thicker than the others, and I watched Dante shake his head with a finality that suggested the discussion was over. "Not until Isla is secure," he said, and hearing my name in the context of their violent planning made my stomach flip. Made real in a way nothing else had the fact that I was now part of this world, whether I wanted to be or not. "I want 4 men on her at all times. I want every entry and exit to this building monitored, and I want to know the moment anyone even looks at this place wrong, and once that's in place, then we'll discuss retaliation. But my priority right now is keeping her alive, and anyone who has a problem with that can find themselves on the wrong end of my displeasure." I must have made some sound, because all 3 men turned to look at me standing in the doorway in my borrowed robe with my hair a mess and my heart pounding against my ribs, and Dante's expression softened fractionally when he saw me, the dangerous Mafia boss retreating enough to let me see the man who'd promised to protect me. "Come here," he said. And it should have been an order, but somehow came out as an invitation, and I found my feet carrying me into the office before my brain could offer any objections. And when I reached his side, he pulled out a chair for me with old-world courtesy that seemed absurd, given we were literally planning violence while I stood there in my pajamas. "These are the men who shot me," Dante said, spreading several surveillance photographs across the table, and I looked down at faces that were surprisingly ordinary. Men who could have been accountants or salesmen if you didn't look too closely at their eyes. And I felt sick knowing that these were the people who wanted me dead simply because I'd had the misfortune of being kind to the wrong stranger. "And this is Victor Constantine, the man who ordered it," he continued, tapping a photograph of a man in his 50s with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. And I understood in that moment that I was looking at someone who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation or remorse. "What are you going to do?" I asked, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. And Dante looked at me with an expression that was almost apologetic, as if he regretted that I had to see this side of his world, but wasn't willing to hide it from me either. "I'm going to end this," he said simply, and the finality in his voice told me exactly what that meant. Told me that people were going to die because of me, because I'd saved his life, and I didn't know how to feel about that except vaguely nauseated and strangely detached, like I was watching all of this happen to someone else entirely. He said I had 2 choices, hide in his world or die in mine. And when he laid it out like that with his dark eyes boring into me like he could see straight through to my soul and his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip, I chose survival and told myself that's all it was. Told myself the way my pulse quickened when he was near had nothing to do with the dangerous charisma that seemed to radiate from him, like heat, and everything to do with normal human fear response. The days that followed blurred together in a strange rhythm of domesticity and danger, where I'd wake up in silk sheets that cost more than my monthly rent and eat breakfast prepared by a professional chef, while men with guns patrolled the hallways outside. And Dante would work from his home office taking calls in 3 different languages and occasionally disappearing for hours, while Alexei assured me in his perpetually emotionless tone that the boss was handling business, and I shouldn't worry my pretty little head about it, which made me want to punch him, except I was fairly certain he could kill me with his pinky finger. I met more of Dante's inner circle as the week progressed, starting with his cousin Mikhail, who had kind eyes that seemed out of place in his scarred face, and who treated me with a gentle courtesy that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the family business, but was too loyal or too trapped to leave it. Katya remained ice-cold and assessing, watching me like I was a bomb that might go off at any moment and destroy her carefully ordered world. And I caught her having hushed arguments with Dante in Russian that I couldn't understand but whose tone suggested she thought I was a liability they couldn't afford. The penthouse became my gilded cage, beautiful and suffocating in equal measure, and I found myself pacing the floor-to-ceiling windows at night, staring out at a city I could see but not touch, watching people live their normal lives far below while I existed in this strange, suspended reality where armed guards shadowed my every movement, and the most dangerous man I'd ever met looked at me sometimes like I was something precious he was terrified of breaking. Dante was constantly present even when he was absent, his cologne lingering in hallways, his voice carrying through walls, his intensity filling every room he entered until I found myself hyper-aware of his location, at all times, like some kind of invisible thread connected us. He was careful with me in a way that seemed almost incongruous with everything else about him, never touching me without permission, always maintaining a respectful distance, speaking to me with a gentleness that his men never received, and I didn't know if it was genuine care or just his way of keeping his asset compliant until the threat was eliminated, and he could return me to my normal life like a library book he'd borrowed and finished reading. The tension between us grew thicker with each passing day, charged moments where our eyes would meet across the dinner table, or our hands would brush when he passed me coffee, and something electric would arc between us that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the kind of attraction that was probably going to get me killed or worse. On the 5th night, Dante summoned me to his office with a formality that seemed ominous, and when I entered, I found him standing by the windows with a tumbler of what looked like very expensive whiskey in his hand, and an expression on his face that I'd come to recognize as the one he wore when he was about to do something dangerous. "We need to attend a dinner tomorrow night," he said without preamble, and when I started to ask what kind of dinner required my presence, he turned to face me fully, and I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like regret mixed with determination. "It's a gathering of the 5 families, a monthly tradition where we maintain the pretense of civility and discuss territory and disputes, and Victor Constantine will be there, and I need him to see you with me. Need him to understand that you're under my protection, and that touching you would be declaring war not just on the Volkov family, but on our allied families as well." The idea of being paraded in front of a room full of mafia bosses like some kind of prize or trophy made my skin crawl, but I could see the strategic logic even if I hated it. Could understand that making my protection a matter of public record might be the only thing standing between me and a bullet to the head. "What do I need to do?" I asked, and Dante's expression softened fractionally, something like approval flickering in his dark eyes before he walked over to where I stood and stopped close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. "You need to look like you belong to me," he said, and the possessiveness in his tone should have made me angry, but instead sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with cold. And before I could process what was happening, his hand came up to cut my jaw with a tenderness that seemed impossible from a man who killed without hesitation. "I know what I'm asking is unfair. Know that you didn't sign up for any of this, but I need Victor to believe that hurting you would hurt me, and the only way he'll believe that is if he sees the way I look at you and recognizes it for what it is. "And what is it?" I whispered, and I was close enough to see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to smell his cologne mixed with the whiskey on his breath, close enough that when he leaned down and pressed his forehead against mine in a gesture that was somehow more intimate than a kiss, I could feel the tremor that ran through his powerful frame. "Something I have no right to feel," he said roughly. And then he was stepping back and putting distance between us, like he didn't trust himself to stay close, and I was left standing there with my heart racing and my skin tingling, and the absolute certainty that I was falling for a man who dealt in death and violence, and that this feeling was either going to save me or destroy me, and I honestly couldn't tell which. The dress that appeared in my room the next morning was a masterpiece of deep emerald silk that clung to curves I didn't know I had, and made my auburn hair look like living flame. And when I emerged from my suite wearing it along with the diamond earrings and necklace that had been left with it, Dante actually stopped mid-sentence in his phone conversation and stared at me with an expression that made me feel powerful and desired and terrified all at once. The dinner was held in a restaurant that had been closed to the public for the evening, and walking in on Dante's arm, wearing a fortune in borrowed jewels, while men in expensive suits turned to assess me with predatory interest, made me understand viscerally what it meant to be prey in a room full of apex predators. Victor Constantine was exactly as dangerous as his photographs suggested, with cold eyes that lingered on me too long and a smile that made my skin crawl, and when he approached to greet Dante with false warmth, I felt Dante's hand tighten on my waist in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. "And who is this lovely creature?" Victor asked, his accent thick and his gaze crawling over me like insects. And I forced myself to meet his eyes without flinching, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. "This is Isla," Dante said, and his voice carried a warning that anyone with half a brain would have heeded. And he pulled me closer against his side in a gesture that left no room for misinterpretation about exactly what I meant to him. "She's under Volkov protection, and I trust that everyone here understands what that means and will conduct themselves accordingly." The dinner proceeded with a veneer of civility that barely disguised the violence simmering beneath every conversation. And I sat beside Dante, picking at food I couldn't taste while negotiations and thinly veiled threats were exchanged over wine that probably cost more than my car. Victor made several more comments about me throughout the evening, always just shy of openly insulting, clearly testing to see how far he could push before Dante snapped, and I could feel the tension radiating from the man beside me, could sense him using every ounce of his considerable self-control to maintain the peace. It was during dessert that everything went wrong, when Victor leaned across the table with that horrible smile and said something in Russian that made Dante go absolutely still beside me, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. And then Dante was standing with a speed that knocked his chair backward, and his hand was on Victor's throat, lifting the older man partially out of his seat, while the entire room erupted into chaos, with guns being drawn and men shouting in multiple languages. "Say that about her again, and there won't be enough pieces of you left to bury," Dante said in a voice like death itself. And I saw Victor's face turning purple, and knew that I was about to watch a man die in front of me, unless I did something to stop it. My hand on Dante's arm was the only thing that penetrated the red haze of his rage, my touch somehow grounding him enough that he released Victor and stepped back. And the older man fell back into his chair, coughing and gasping, while his men kept their weapons trained on Dante with the kind of tension that suggested we were seconds away from a massacre. "Dante, please," I whispered, and something in my voice, fear or pleading or maybe just the sound of my voice saying his name, made him turn to look at me. And I saw the moment the humanity returned to his eyes, saw him choose me over violence even though it cost him. We left the restaurant in tense silence with Alexei and a small army of guards surrounding us, and the drive back to the penthouse felt like riding in a hearse. And when we finally made it inside, Dante disappeared into his office, and I heard the sound of breaking glass and shouted curses in Russian that made even the hardened guards wince. I should have gone to my room, should have locked the door, and pretended I hadn't just seen how close we'd come to a bloodbath. But instead I found myself standing outside his office door, working up the courage to knock. And when I finally did, his rough, "Come in," sounded like an invitation to my own destruction. He was standing by his desk with his jacket discarded and his shirt partially unbuttoned, and there was broken glass scattered across the floor from what had probably been a very expensive decanter. And when he looked up at me, his eyes were wild with barely contained violence and something else, something that looked like desperate need. "You should go," he said, but he was already moving toward me, and I was already stepping into the room and closing the door behind me with a decisive click that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the charged silence. "What did he say?" I asked, because I needed to know what had pushed him over the edge, and Dante's jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "He said you were pretty for a whore, and asked how much I was paying you to warm my bed, and then he suggested that once I was done with you, perhaps he'd take a turn and see if you were worth the trouble I'd gone to protecting you," Dante said, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, like he was physically restraining himself from going back to finish what he'd started. "I wanted to kill him right there, wanted to paint that restaurant with his blood, and the only thing that stopped me was you, was the knowledge that starting a war would put you in even more danger. But God help me, Isla. I've never wanted to murder someone more in my entire life." The raw honesty in his confession broke something open inside me, and I crossed the distance between us without conscious thought, and reached up to frame his face with my hands, feeling the tension in his jaw, and seeing the war raging behind his eyes. "I'm okay," I said softly, and his eyes closed like my words caused him physical pain, and then his hands came up to cover mine where they rested against his face. "Tell me to leave, Isla," he said, and his voice was rough and desperate, and his eyes opened to pin me with an intensity that stole my breath. "Tell me you don't feel this thing between us. Tell me to walk away before I do something we'll both regret, because I'm hanging on by a thread here and you're looking at me like—" He broke off, and I knew what he meant, because I could feel it too. This thing that had been building between us since that first night in the parking garage, this attraction that was probably going to destroy us both, but felt inevitable as gravity. "I can't," I whispered, and that was all the permission he needed before he was pulling me against him, and his mouth was on mine in a kiss that tasted like whiskey and desperation and promises neither of us should make. And I knew in that moment that I'd crossed a line I could never uncross, that I was falling in love with a monster who'd somehow become the most important person in my world, and that whatever happened next was going to change everything. They say you can't love a monster, that there's something fundamentally broken in a person who looks at a man capable of casual violence and sees not horror but home. But they're wrong, because you absolutely can love him with every fiber of your being. It just might destroy you both in the process. And as I lay in Dante's arms in the aftermath of our collision, feeling his heartbeat thundering against my cheek and his fingers tracing idle patterns on my bare shoulder, I realized that I'd been falling since that first moment in the parking garage, and had finally hit the ground with the kind of impact that shatters everything you thought you knew about yourself. The days that followed our first night together were a revelation of tenderness, hidden beneath brutality, of Dante showing me pieces of himself that I suspected few people ever saw. The boy who'd watched his mother die when he was 12, shot down in their driveway by enemies of his father as a message and a warning. The teenager who'd been shaped into a weapon by a man who believed love was weakness and mercy was suicide. The leader who carried the weight of hundreds of lives and families on his shoulders and never let anyone see how heavy that burden truly was. We existed in a strange bubble of domesticity punctuated by the ever-present threat of violence, where Dante would take calls about territory disputes and body disposal while making me coffee exactly how I liked it, where I'd tend his healing wounds with professional efficiency before he'd pull me into his lap and kiss me like I was the only thing keeping him tethered to humanity. And I knew it was twisted, and probably unhealthy, and definitely not what any rational person would call a normal relationship. But I'd stopped caring about normal the moment I'd chosen to save his life, instead of my own safety. Katya remained disapproving, but had thawed fractionally after walking in on Dante and me having breakfast together, and seeing the way her brother looked at me with something approaching genuine happiness in his usually guarded eyes. And even Alexei had started treating me with a grudging respect that suggested he'd accepted I wasn't going anywhere regardless of how inconvenient that might be for everyone involved. But the threat of Victor Constantine hung over everything like a storm cloud waiting to break. And I could see the tension building in Dante as reports came in about movements and meetings and preparations that suggested something big was coming. And I knew with a certainty that sat like lead in my stomach that this fragile piece we'd carved out was about to be shattered in blood and violence. It happened on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the disastrous dinner, when I was reading in the library and Dante burst in with Alexei and Mikhail on his heels and an expression on his face that made my blood run cold. And before I could ask what was wrong, he was pulling me to my feet and saying words that didn't make sense. Kidnapped, warehouse, trap, Constantine. Until finally my brain processed that Victor had taken me, except that was impossible because I was standing right here. And then Dante was showing me security footage on his phone of a woman who looked remarkably like me being forced into a van outside what appeared to be my old apartment building. "It's not me," I said stupidly, and Dante's expression was wild with barely controlled rage and something that looked terrifyingly like fear. And he gripped my shoulders hard enough to bruise while explaining that Victor had grabbed a woman who matched my description thinking she was me. And now he was using her as bait to draw Dante into an ambush where he planned to kill us both and spark the war he'd been angling for since the beginning. The rational part of my brain knew I should let Dante's men handle it, knew that getting involved would only make things worse. But the part of me that had become a nurse because I couldn't save my brother was already moving, was already grabbing Dante's arm and saying that we had to save her, that an innocent woman was going to die because she had the misfortune of looking like me. And I watched the conflict play out on Dante's face as he weighed my safety against the life of a stranger. "You're not going," he said finally, and it was an order that brooked no argument. And I felt fury rise in my chest hot and righteous because I was so tired of being treated like fragile porcelain that needed protecting, while everyone else got to make choices and take action. We argued, our voices rising until we were nearly shouting at each other, while Alexei and Mikhail tried very hard to blend into the furniture. And finally Dante grabbed my face between his hands and pressed his forehead to mine in that gesture that had become uniquely ours, and said with devastating honesty that he couldn't do his job if he was worried about me, that he needed to know I was safe so he could focus on destroying Victor Constantine once and for all. And I saw in his eyes that this was about more than just tactics or strategy, but about the very real terror that he might lose me the way he'd lost his mother. So I stayed behind in the penthouse surrounded by enough guards to invade a small country, while Dante left with his entire Bratva army to rescue a woman he'd never met, because I'd asked him to. And I paced the floor for hours imagining every possible horrible outcome until I thought I'd go insane from the waiting. When the call finally came, it was Mikhail's voice tight with pain and urgency telling me to get to the warehouse address he was texting me, because Dante had been shot and was asking for me. And I didn't think, didn't hesitate, just grabbed my medical bag that I'd insisted on keeping, despite having no official role here, and ran for the private elevator with my heart in my throat, and prayers to a god I'd stopped believing in tumbling from my lips. The warehouse was a nightmare of blood and bodies, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. And I found Dante propped against a wall, with Alexei applying pressure to a wound in his side, while Mikhail coordinated cleanup of what had clearly been an all-out war. And when Dante's eyes found mine across the carnage, the relief in them was so profound, it brought tears to my eyes. I worked on him there on the dirty warehouse floor, my hands steady despite my terror, cleaning and packing and stabilizing, while he watched me with an intensity that felt like being burned alive. And when I'd done everything I could, he pulled me down to him and kissed me, with a desperation that tasted like blood and smoke, and the kind of love that survives apocalypse. "The woman?" I asked, when we finally broke apart. And Dante's expression shifted to something almost like pride, as he nodded toward where a terrified brunette sat wrapped in someone's jacket being tended to by one of his men. shaken but alive and relatively unharmed. "And Victor?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the grim satisfaction in Dante's eyes and the body I'd carefully avoided looking at in the center of the warehouse floor. And he cupped my face with a blood-stained hand and told me it was over, that the threat was eliminated, and the other families had already been notified that the Constantine organization would be absorbed by the Volkovs, and that I was safe now, free to return to my normal life if that's what I wanted. The choice he was offering me hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility and consequence, and I knew he was giving me an out. A chance to walk away from this world of violence and darkness and return to my safe, boring existence as just another nurse working too many hours and going home to an empty apartment. But as I looked at this man who'd killed for me and nearly died for me and had somehow become the axis around which my entire world rotated, I knew that there was no going back. That the woman I'd been before that night in the parking garage was as dead as Victor Constantine, and in her place was someone who'd chosen love over safety and passion over peace, and had discovered that she was strong enough to survive in this world of beautiful monsters. "I'm staying," I said, and the words felt like both a surrender and a victory. And Dante's eyes closed like I'd given him something infinitely precious. And when he opened them again, there was a vulnerability there that took my breath away. "Be my queen," he said. And it wasn't quite a proposal, but it was a promise of forever in a world where forever was measured in survived dangers and stolen moments of peace. And when he slid a ring onto my finger, later I'd learn it had been his mother's, kept hidden for decades waiting for someone worthy. I felt the weight of it like a crown, and a chain, and a choice I was making with full knowledge of what it meant. The epilogue to our twisted love story was written in the months that followed. In lazy Sunday mornings where Dante would make me laugh with stories of his childhood before violence stole his innocence. In formal dinners where I sat beside him as his acknowledged partner and met the eyes of dangerous men without flinching. In quiet nights where he'd wake from nightmares and I'd hold him until the demons retreated and he could sleep again. I helped an injured man in a parking garage not knowing he was a Mafia boss, and he destroyed my safe life and remade me in fire and blood, and a love that burned hot enough to forge something entirely new from the ashes of who we'd been before. They say you can't love a monster. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes the monster loves you back with a ferocity that makes you understand why people write epics about love and war. Why passion and violence have always been twins. Why the most dangerous thing in the world isn't the man who can kill without remorse, but the one who finds something worth dying for and chooses to live instead. I chose survival that night when Dante gave me my options, but what I found was so much more. I found a home in the arms of a devil, found strength in embracing darkness, found that loving the monster was the first time I'd ever truly felt alive. And I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat, because some love stories aren't meant to be safe or simple or sane. They're meant to be epic and devastating and utterly, completely, impossibly worth every risk you took to claim them.